Hello, I'm Christopher Preble. I'm the co-director of the New American Engagement Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. And I want to thank you for joining us today for this NAEI event on global energy security after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We have all experienced at least one of the global consequences of Russia's war when we fill up at the gas pump, but the dramatic changes to energy markets taking place are likely to shape geopolitics for decades to come. We here at NAEI are lucky to have Dr. Emma Ashford as part of our team to help us understand these global dynamics. Emma is a senior fellow here at NAEI and a well-known and respected commentator on international relations. She has a particular expertise on the geopolitics of energy markets and, not coincidentally, has a book out today on this very topic. It is called Oil, the State and War, the Foreign Policies of Petrostates, published by Georgetown University Press. My colleague, Evan Cooper, will drop more information about the book in the Zoom chat. With that, I'll turn it over to Emma to discuss what her findings say about the intersection between Russia's war and energy, as well as to introduce our other panelists. Thank you again for joining us, and do please put any questions you have in the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. With that, over to you, Emma.
Great, thanks, Chris, for that lovely introduction, and thanks to you all for joining us today. I think the topic of the book it turned out to be a little more perhaps topically relevant than I had assumed at the time when I handed the manuscript in a year and a half ago. But many of the themes of the book are highly relevant to some of the shifts and changes that we are seeing today in energy markets, and in particular, how oil and gas production interact with foreign policy in petrostates. Over the last couple of decades, the number of armed conflicts has declined between states, and this has been widely noted. But there's also been a notable exception, and that is states which produce or export a lot of oil. Sometimes you'll hear them described as petrostates or oil-rich states, but whatever you call them, they're more likely to start conflicts. These states are often highly integrated into global markets, and their actions in the international community pose some unique challenges for how we, particularly in the West, understand and handle their behavior. And these are facts that have been made highly visible in the last few months by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the resulting fallout that has caused in international commodities markets. But it isn't just Russia. In the book, I explore the different ways in which oil and gas interact with foreign policy in the context of these petrostates. Much of the previous work on this topic is focused more on energy security, and as we'll talk about later today, that's a very salient concern for many Western states, particularly at the moment. But I'd argue that it's equally important to understand the ways in which oil and gas shape the behavior of the states that produce them in the international system. And we should understand that there are different ways in which oil and gas production can influence states' foreign policy. Some petrostates, for example, are extremely wealthy as a result of all their oil and gas production. That wealth can be used for social spending domestically, that's well known. It can also be used to buy weapons. It can be used to build up one's military, to fund and arm proxies abroad. Or it simply can be used by these states to buy goodwill through international charitable or philanthropic concerns. Russia poured a substantial amount of money into its military modernization in the wake of its poor showing in the 2008 Georgia war, and much of that money came from its oil and gas sales. Of course, the Russian case also highlights some of the limits of that spending. As we've seen, the Russian military's effectiveness in Ukraine has been heavily undermined by factors like corruption, and that's another way in which oil and gas production can shape foreign policy outcomes. We know from work done in comparative politics that oil and gas producing states are very vulnerable to domestic economic and political dysfunction. They're vulnerable to corruption. They sometimes suffer from what is called the resource curse, and that has implications for foreign policy making in these states, which can often be less effective, more personalistic, and less professionalized. And then finally, there are broader macro questions about international political economy and the role that these states play in it. Some oil and gas producing states are very rich, but not particularly influential globally, but others produce large percentages of world oil supply. And this can make them very influential and give them leverage in international politics. And again, in the context of the war in Ukraine, we have seen just how difficult it can be to cut a major producing state like Russia out of international energy markets without substantial collateral damage to our own economies. And the result can be to insulate large exporting states like Russia from the negative consequences of their bad behavior. It's far harder to sanction a petrostate. So these are some of the different ways in which we can think about the interactions between oil and foreign policy behavior by states. And it's not just Russia. We could think about Saudi Arabia, we could think about Iran, we could think about Norway or Canada. There are a variety of petrostates, and they interact with the international system in different ways. But I would argue that the most important question here is that the study of petrostates is necessarily a study of a lot of other things, of global arms sales, of sanctions policy, of why some states go to war and where they find the means to do so. And so while I'm pleased to be discussing the book today, I'm also very pleased to have joining me for a panel on the question of global energy security after Ukraine, to have some distinguished experts in energy security questions more broadly. And I'll just introduce them briefly here. We have Dr. Ellen Wald, who is a non-resident senior fellow in the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. And then we have Amy Myers-Jaffe, a research professor and a managing director at the Climate Policy Lab at Tufts University, and both are well known for their commentary and insights on international energy markets and how they intersect with global geopolitics. So we're going to have a discussion here, not only of the book, but more importantly, of some of the big implications of the war in Ukraine for global energy security. And obviously, we've had some significant events on this yesterday, including the deal by the European Union to ban most oil imports from Russia. So I'm going to start by asking our panelists to give us just a couple of minutes of their thoughts on this topic, on what they see as the biggest energy security issues stemming from the war in Ukraine, on how we should think about petrostates and how they fit into global markets, and anything else that they think is relevant. So I will turn it over to Ellen first, and then to Amy. Ellen, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, and congratulations on the publication of your book. It's really fantastic work, and you should be very proud. And I do encourage everyone to go out and buy a copy. I thought I would say a little bit about, in terms of energy security and the impact of the Ukraine crisis and Russia's war in Ukraine, which is that it seems to really have been divided into two different categories. There's the impact from the actual war, potential disruptions in terms of the actual transportation and of petroleum and petroleum products, either out of ports that are affected or via pipelines that are affected. And we saw that particularly in the initial stages of certain shipping routes being affected. And so that's kind of the first issue in terms of energy security, I would say. And then the second is the reaction of many Western countries to this war and the resulting attempts to cut down or ban purchases of Russian oil in an attempt to cut off Russia's revenue stream, with the idea that that will affect the foreign policy and the military decisions of Russia. And I think that, there's a lot of steps there, and a lot of questions are raised of whether these policies that are being put into place by Western countries will have the desired effect of curbing Russian oil revenues, and whether that in turn will even impact foreign policy and Russia's foreign policy. I think that Emma's book says a lot about the way that these petrostates act and how they view foreign policy. And so it's important, I think, when crafting policies from, say, our side, that we think about how what the reactions will be from the petrostates and how and their views. So I think that the book is particularly helpful in providing insights in that respect. And then one other issue about, in terms of energy security, is that because Russia is such a big player in the global market, it does impact energy security of basically every every country in the world, and we're seeing it. Even the United States, which doesn't import very much Russian crude oil, in fact, really didn't import any Russian crude oil other than a little bit last year. Yes, there were more imports of Russian refined products, but we're seeing how the disruption in the global flow of crude oil and oil products because of this and because of these policies is impacting the US energy security. Just to give a really quick example of that was the shortage of diesel fuel that we saw on the East Coast recently was really in large part caused by a disruption in the Atlantic trade of these products because if Europe's not getting diesel from Russia, they're getting it from somewhere else, and then the United States isn't trading diesel the same way that they were with Europe, and so the Atlantic seaboard, then where were they going to get their diesel from? It's very difficult for them to actually get it from the Gulf because of the Jones Act and difficulties with shipping, and it wasn't really going through the Colonial Pipeline due to backwardation issues. So that resulted in essentially shortages of diesel fuel on the East Coast of the United States. And so you can see how, because we're in such an interconnected market, how even if the US isn't a big importer of Russian crude oil, how these changes in the flow of oil globally impact energy security even for the United States. And I do think that as the US goes forward in crafting policies, I know there's consideration to crafting new policies in response to these new EU sanctions against Russian oil, that the effect on our population, on the United States and consumers and the prices of things should be considered, because we're all part of this same global marketplace, and we're all being impacted by the actions of Russia and of the EU and other countries.
Great. Thank you so much, Ellen. Amy, over to you.
I'm going to take a slightly different tack. I highly recommend Emma's book. It's really quite great. And one of the things I really like about the book is she creates sort of a taxonomy where one has 3 classifications of petrostates, because we throw that term around and we think it has a clear definition. And so she spends some time really going down deeper into what do we mean by petrostate, and looking at the difference between just a resource curse, economy where a high percentage of the government's revenue or budget is coming from oil and gas, versus a state that is using its oil and gas for geopolitical influence, versus a state that controls a very high share of the global market and therefore has more power / influence, versus could be a bigger threat / problem if something goes wrong. And I think those classifications help elucidate the idea that oil can elevate the stature of a country in a multipolar world. And I think that if someone were to read Jeff Colgan's book, Partial Hegemony, and pair it with Emma's book, you'd have a really good understanding that the old paradigms of IR, international relations work, where we just look at the relationship between Russia, the United States, and China, is not going to actually give us the right answer in fashioning an approach to US foreign policy, and that oil does give us this little extra window. And what I like about Emma's approach is that she doesn't link it only to military, because of course we now know in this world of social media and information influence and political influence buying in the United States and elsewhere, that the oil revenue that comes to countries can be used to buy arms. And how many wars are we going to see every decade that are financed by oil? We're now on our multiple oil, which I've written about in my book, Oil, Dollars, Debt, and Crises, this repeating pattern of a high oil price followed by a low oil price that then stimulates the a country to use the revenue they gained in the period of the low oil price to, like during COVID, when we had this horrible collapse in everybody's economy, did that stimulate Russia to formulate how to take these dollars that it's amassed in the military and distract its own population from internal problems by having an external war? So that's a repeating pattern in the sort of petrostate oil price cycle. But there's some other issues that I want to just throw on the table for our discussion, because it's not just this vicious cycle of the petro curse, where this boom bust cycle in oil leads to revenues, the revenues are spent on weaponry, and the weaponry is then used on a neighboring state or a country's own population. But we also have this new concern, which I write about in my book, Energy's Digital Future, which as we move to, which I still believe in, peak oil demand, as we see a reversal of the growth in oil demand, which obviously might not happen this year, but will happen, I think, inevitably. And I might argue, unlike everybody else, that the war is actually going to hasten that and not actually stretch it longer into the future. That we run this danger that as countries that are gaining geopolitical stature from their resources, seeing that might fade over time, might convince those states that they need to use their hard power now, and increasingly so. And I've written that, and I think that could be a theoretical explanation for the why now with Russia and Ukraine, as opposed to stopping in Crimea in 2014 or waiting another 5 years. And so that gets to the role of the petrostate in global diplomacy and in global diplomacy around the energy transition. Are you using your assets to deflect the energy transition, or are you using your assets, say in the case of Saudi Arabia or UAE, some assets are being used to hedge against the energy transition and make sure you're pivoting to new energy. So how the United States manages the pivot to hard power, and hard power can be military, or it could be cyber, or it could be influence, disinformation and misinformation, and how the United States works to bring petrostates along to the global agenda for climate change. Because ironically, some of the countries that have the most to lose economically from a peak in oil use are also the countries that might be most severely impacted by climate change. And in Russia, the permafrost thaw is a major threat to its own oil and gas industry, and of course other parts of its population. But there's some writings about the fact that Vladimir Putin sees climate change as an amazing opportunity that is going to enhance agricultural production in Russia and open the sea lanes from ice more months out of the year. So, half glass, half full, they're having fires and all these other impacts, but that's not really the focus of the policy. And in the Gulf, I think the understanding of what rising temperatures and food insecurity is going to mean over time is starting to get, I think, a deeper appreciation. So I guess I'll just leave it there. Those are things that have to be managed by the US. And I do know that a lot of effort was put in by the Biden administration to engage both Russia and a lot of the other petrostates on the lead up to Glasgow. And I'm in retrospect, it looked kind of successful on the way in, but maybe now in retrospect, it wasn't as successful as it looked at the time.
Great. Well, thank you both for those really interesting comments and for your kind words about the book. I'll pay you after the event. But I was hoping, I guess, to sort of ask a question that relates to both of your remarks a little, because I think, you've both highlighted the complexity of this international energy system. And we all start out, you're teaching undergraduates about energy security, and you teach them about the bathtub metaphor, and oil comes in and oil goes out. And that is a wonderful lie to children that generally explains the oil market. But there's all these other moving parts, types of oil, types of products, refineries, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's this, as Ellen points out, this incredibly complex system where changes in one place impact, places a long, long way away. And so I guess my question is, just looking at the European Union's steps that it's taken in the last few days, looking at some of the other reactions that we've seen, the Indians stepping in to buy more Russian oil. Is this a case where, we are going to see a global energy infrastructure, global energy market that adapts to the war in Ukraine and looks very different in a year or 5 years to what it does now in terms of whose oil goes where? Or is this something where you think we're going to see sort of some shocks now, but things are going to basically look very similar in the near future? And so I'm curious if either of you want to tackle that question.
Yeah,
go for it, Ellen.
I'll go. I'll offer a few thoughts first. That's a really great question, because I think it's what a lot of people are considering, and I think that the answer depends on how long the conflict in Ukraine persists, because a lot of the policies that we're seeing in terms of sanctions that would cause rerouting of oil are kind of geared to take effect between now and the end of the year, or in 9 months. And so I think that if there is some kind of resolution or peace agreement or whatnot, or cessation of hostilities that Western countries can at least get behind, then they would probably cease their bans on Russian oil, or at least relax them somewhat, or at least give themselves longer lead times. And then we wouldn't see quite as much reorganization. But oil markets respond very quickly. It doesn't feel that quickly to consumers when you go to the pump and you're like, oh my goodness, last week gasoline cost $3.75 a gallon, and now it's $5 a gallon, and you're wondering what in the world is going on. But if you look at the numbers and you can see how Russia has really responded to this self-sanctioning, in fact, that we saw going on. For example, I'll give you an example. In December, Russia's top, from December 2021, Russia's top exports, so their top place that they exported to was China, and then their second highest was the Netherlands. And then after that, we had South Korea, Italy, Sweden, Poland, Turkey, Lithuania, Finland, etc. So that's what they were doing in December. Now, if you look at what Russia did in April, which is, we really have the most complete numbers for that. Their top exporter was still China, but they've significantly increased their exports to China. The next is India, and India was so far down on Russia's list, it was barely it barely registered. Now in April, they exported over 700,000 barrels a day of crude oil to India. So they just kind of suddenly open this new market in India. And so you can really see how quickly that happens. And when you're talking about policy, is that displacing oil that can then go to Europe from other places? That's a good question. Will Europeans need to pay more money for this, for their oil, to kind of induce Gulf countries to divert oil supplies that were going to Asia to go to the EU instead? We may see that. I think that we're really in the process of watching the oil market reorganize in front of our eyes. And yes, it's a painful process to be inside of it, because it causes a lot of price dislocation and a lot of volatility, but it is happening. And as long as we don't see kind of reactionary responses from countries like, oh, we're going to ban oil exports. So if, say, the United States decided to reinstate its oil export ban, that would really kind of throw a wrench in the whole process. But otherwise, I do think we are seeing a reorganization, and that is going to continue as long as the policies and the hostilities in Ukraine go on.
So let me add to that a little bit. I don't disagree with anything Ellen's saying, and her basic summary point is that we have these temporary dislocations in the market. We've seen them before the market adjusts. And during the period of the initial dislocation, prices go up, but then eventually they go back down. We saw that in the Gulf War. We've seen that in other times. So I do want to point out a couple other things about this idea that, everybody's going to kiss and make up and the Russian oil will just stay in the market, or it's going to get shifted around or whatever. I think you have to look at Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela used to be a major exporter. It had at one point plans to really increase its production and become an even bigger, in Emma's terms, an even bigger super, I forget what you call it, super a petrostate. And
exporter.
Exporter. And now the country is basically a failed state when it comes to its economy. And I would argue that even if the government there changed, or it reopened to elections and there was great reforms and so forth, its surface industry is so destroyed, it's unclear to me whether companies would really actually want to go back there and make investments, given the longer term outlook for other places you can invest that are more stable and less expensive and have larger fields. Venezuela typically has very small, intricate fields. So, and actually, the history has been of all these oil shocks that we've had globally. When you look at the actual economics of who won and who lost, the industrialized countries, and I would include the sort of Chinas and Indias in that, their economies recover much more quickly and much more substantially afterwards, whether that's through alternative energy or energy efficiency. In the United States now, we use no oil in electricity generation. That came after an oil shock. So economies change structurally. And once they change structurally, it's permanent. And then they become less oil intensive to generate a unit of GDP, which is happening in all the major economies, including China. And this shock will be no different. And so the interesting thing that the research shows is that the economic setback for the petrostates, including the super petrostates, is much more long lasting and much more devastating. Even from the oil price shock, given the potential, even after the revenue comes in, especially because the revenues go into weaponry and not into development, and therefore the penalty when the oil price collapses, which it eventually will do, whether that's through recession or through policy, eventually then that hits the petrostate economy even harder. And we see economies like Iraq, like Venezuela, that have never recovered. Even in the case of Iraq, as its oil industry is recovered, its economy is not recovered. And so I think that in thinking about how to get out of this cycle, one has to, think about that process. And then when you think about, sort of winners and losers, I want to add to Ellen's statistic that U.S. total exports of product and crude oil is above 10 million barrels a day now. We used to think a couple years ago that the 3 million barrels a day of exports was miraculous. The first time somebody told me that number was up to 5 million barrels a day, I couldn't believe it. Now it is at 10 million barrels a day. Think about the strength of the U.S. refining industry and of the U.S. Production industry. And I people have said this stuff about capital discipline and so forth, and there's probably some element to that, but I do think we're going to get back to the 13 million barrel a day number we were seeing with the contribution of shale. So, so you have these countries like the United States, at some point, Canada, are going to punch above their weight, and the United States is in a pretty favorable position, I would say, even though it doesn't feel like that politically, because we're such a divided nation in how we describe things to ourselves. The reality is the U.S. oil industry is a big winner, both upstream and downstream. The United States' influence in the global market is much larger than it was before Russia invaded Ukraine. And the role of U.S. products and natural gas in the global economy is even more important now than it was, 6 months ago. So I think that's a big takeaway. And one of the things that's enabled that to happen, even though we're talking about the higher rates at the pump, the release of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was enabling, because it was done in a timely manner. In the past, sometimes we released the SPR way after the fact, and it's kind of too late to make a difference. That wasn't true. It was used effectively during the Gulf War, but other times it's not been effective. But I would say this time was effective, so effective. And Ellen and I have tweeted back and forth to each other about this, so effective that Saudi Arabia itself purchased barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve for its US-based refinery, rather than use its own crude oil.
So thank you, and that's a really interesting point. I particularly am intrigued by the idea that we might be able to draw some lessons from our sanctions history with Iran, with Venezuela, and with Russia today. That we might be able to draw some lessons from that as to how states might adapt to the green transition. I mean, there's obviously some big differences here, mostly in terms of timing, suddenness, whether you can see a market coming back on the horizon. But the fact is, as you say, that most of these states have not done well in adapting to a scenario in which they can't get their oil revenues, and that doesn't bode well for these states in the long run. And something I talk about a little in the book is, we might want to worry about whether the pathologies that come with that oil persist after the oil is gone, and that would sort of be the worst of all worlds here. So Ellen, you've been really patient, and I want to come back to you and ask you a little about the Gulf states, because I think most of the discussions of energy security after Ukraine have focused really heavily on, on European energy security, maybe on India, on China. But the Gulf states have been really hands-off during this crisis, refusing to engage the US in conversations about oil prices, maintaining their ties to Russia, sort of suggesting, that they are mostly driven by business or oil price considerations. But I wonder if you see more than that in this. Is this a genuine political shift, or is this really about sort of oil price considerations above all?
So I definitely want to comment on that. I thought also the idea of what we can learn maybe though from previous sanctions is a really interesting comment. And I just want to say one thing about what maybe we could learn from the Iran sanctions, especially because it seems like a lot of US sanctions policy developments toward Russia are being kind of either crafted by people who were influential or in crafting the sanctions against Iran, or that they're kind of drawing on lessons from that. And I think that it's that Russia is a whole different player, in my opinion, from Iran, both in terms of the amount of oil that it puts on the market and its power as an economic force. And I'm not an expert in the Russian economy, but one of the things to consider is especially the unilateral sanctions that the Trump administration put into place against Iran were at their height of enforcement very successful in getting Iranian barrels off the market. I think at the most they were exporting like maybe 500,000. That was like the lowest amount that they got them down to. And the fact is, and that really did kill a lot of Iran's revenue because oil prices were quite low at that point as well. Now it's a very different situation. Oil prices are very high. Iran's able to export more, and they're really, that's showing in their lack of desire to engage in new negotiations over their nuclear policies. But even at the height when it, kind of destroyed the Iranian economy, it didn't produce regime change, or it didn't collapse the government. Yes, it produced a lot of hardship and issues for the government. And so I think that, it would be important when we're thinking about how we use sanctions policies against petrostates that, you can hurt them, you can hurt their revenue so much that they're not even making much, but is that really going to give you the desired foreign policy outcome that you're looking for? And I think that you need to think that even for states that are largely dependent on revenues from petroleum sales, that sanctions cannot be the only foreign policy tool right now, and that perhaps we're maybe overusing or replacing a lot of faith in we're putting kind of all of our policy balls into sanctions, and we're not thinking about other policy avenues. So that's kind of a thing that I think maybe we could learn from the Iran sanctions, and also that they're very hard to implement. There are a lot of ways that they try to evade sanctions, and it takes a lot of time and effort to kind of catch that. But then now shifting to the Gulf states, I think that we've seen a really, really interesting kind of dynamic emerging in this because of this Russia-Ukraine issue. And that's the United States was very outspoken about wanting the Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia, to increase oil production in order to bring down the price of oil globally. And the response from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who are two countries that have a significant clout in OPEC and in OPEC Plus, and also are really some of the only countries that have significant spare capacity at this point, is basically like, no, we're not going to do that. We are only going to increase our production within the confines of the agreement that we made with all these other OPEC countries and Russia. And that calls for incremental increases in production quotas. And even then, they haven't necessarily been increasing their production to the most that they can do. And I think that that is really a reflection of the role that Russia has come to play within OPEC and the importance of Russia to Saudi Arabia and UAE, because without Russia, they really have very little oil market clout at this point, and they really do need Russia in order to have any chance at impacting the market. And obviously we can debate whether OPEC really is effective at impacting the market. I know certain people have very strong thoughts on that, but they certainly found that they really couldn't do it very much without Russia. And they spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of diplomacy bringing Russia into the fold, and kind of elevating Russia within the group, making them feel important and keeping them there. And so that's their long game. I think in the long term, they really like to keep Russia in, and they see that it's not worth it to just kind of abandon their commitments with Russia at this point, just to, maybe have a slight impact on the price of oil for the United States. The Biden administration could only last for 4 years, and then it'll be a totally new person, and they're still going to be in the same position. They have a much longer frame than just, say, 4 years of one administration. And I think that's where we're seeing this. I don't necessarily think it's a shift in policy. I think that the US is still very important to these countries, but if you look at how they're playing their game and what their long-term considerations are, Russia is more important to their ability to continue to what they see as manage the oil market than the United States is at this point. And so it's not surprising that they haven't outright said, we prefer Russia to the United States, but they've basically been saying, well, we don't believe that the current oil prices are due to a lack of supply. We think that they're due to conditions outside of our control, which they're not totally wrong about that. There's definitely a huge speculative impact on oil prices now that's due to whatever happens in Russia, Ukraine. I mean, we saw prices go up and down just based on a headline about whether or not the EU was sitting down to talk about a ban, or whether they had broken off talks. And that's really not something that OPEC can impact. Even putting more barrels on the market wouldn't necessarily change that. So they do have some of a point there when it comes to that. But I do see it as they're definitely want to keep Russia in the fold. They don't want to burn their bridges with Russia, and this is part of their policy.
Let me just throw on one last little point to what Ellen's point, which I think is very intriguing. I might argue, just to be controversial, that the United States is not less important to the oil and gas market than Russia, and that view that somehow only through this alliance with Russia, because the United States is not important in the oil and gas market, can the Gulf states protect their interests? I'm not really sure that that's the case. And I would argue the following thing. Number one, which we now are really understanding, which is that Russia's exports are actually pretty small. If you consider the fact that we're talking about replacing 3 or 4 million barrels a day, during the Gulf War, we had to replace 5 million barrels a day. The United States is exporting total products and crude oil over 10 million barrels a day, which puts it on par with Saudi Arabia in some respect, though I guess I'm not adding in the Saudi products, so maybe still a little bit below Saudis, but we could throw in biofuels. We could throw in other policies of the United States, our natural gas exports. So the United States, according to Emma's definition, I'd be interested to hear Emma's commentary. I mean, we are definitely a super petrostate, even though we have a diversified economy and we're not an oil dependent economy, but we're still a super petrostate. And so I do think that when the Gulf countries consider their alliances and what I would call, maybe, again, going back to my original comments, maybe the fact that the United States is aligned with the idea of the energy transition, and looking at hydrogen and looking at other alternative energy. And somebody mentioned nuclear in the chat. So United States has a stated policy started under Trump, continued under Biden administration, to promote small reactors, so SMRs and advanced reactors, as not only for the United States, but as an export business. So in that regard, if you think about Venezuela and some other examples, Libya, no longer that influential in the energy market, it might be more valuable to a country like the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Qatar to consider its alliances with the United States and the potential for a soft landing in coordination with the United States, than to focus on this 4 million barrels a day of Russian exports that are now going to be disrupted and might not come back in the same way they have been in the past, which we know from Venezuela and others might not come back.
That's a really, really interesting point. And I think, the elephant in the room of this whole discussion is the United States, which as you point out, by my own definition of the book, the United States is a super producer. It's becoming a super exporter. Now, we probably will not export more than we consume domestically for quite some time yet, if that even happens. But still, the United States, this is not just giving us a boost in energy security domestically. It's also having downstream geopolitical impacts. It is pushing the Gulf states at this point, as Ellen said, closer to Russia. It is pushing them closer to customers like China. But that could change. And so again, I think one of the questions that we should all be asking ourselves coming out of the Ukraine crisis is, are we going to see some major transcendental shift in the energy market here? Or are we basically talking about, musical chairs, that everybody's going to move around for a couple of years, but things are going to remain basically the same otherwise, just with different partners trading with one another. So on that note, I do want to turn it over to my colleague, Evan Cooper, who's going to conduct our Q&A. And a reminder to the audience, if you have a question, please drop it in the Q&A function, and we will try to get to as many as we can. Evan, please take us away.
Thanks, Emma. This question, and there's actually a couple that hit on this, go to the last point that Amy was making, and to what you just said as well, Emma, which is, if sanctions were to be relaxed on countries like Iran, on Venezuela, would their ability to increase production into the global oil market offset enough to significantly change or revert to what we were seeing before? And are there other measures outside of those countries that have been taken off the oil market? My colleague Robert Manning raised the question of particularly gas, oil and gas production being increased in the Mediterranean, and plans that have been floated for that. Would those be enough to offset these changes, or are we really just looking at, if Russia is isolated, that will have, so long as this conflict is going on, as Ellen suggested earlier, this effect on reducing supply overall?
I guess I don't know. No one's responding. So let me just say, it's a cyclical industry. Always at the beginning of a dislocation, it looks like there's not enough spending and there's not going to be enough supply response. And that never turns out to be the case overall in the longer run. There's still a lot of oil and gas under the ground. There's still capital willing to be expended. And oftentimes what happens, which we just know historically, is you can get a mismatch between the moment in time people decide to spend the money and they pull the trigger on that, and when the oil and gas emerges and what's happening with the global economy as a result of the price shock. So the interesting question today, I always tell people COVID produced like a super cycle shock. Because we lost a huge amount of demand all at once, and we lost production because people literally had to stop drilling because they had a storage containment problem for physical oil, right? And let's not forget that some countries had to come to the United States just to find a place to store their oil. So we had that shock, and then because of the vaccine and because of good stimulus programs around the world, we had this, again, sudden recovery in demand for which the supply had trouble catching up. And then on top of that, now we have the military conflict. So I personally feel like, the oil industry always says there's a supply hole and it's going to last for 3 years or 5 years, and they're going to make lots of money, and we should all buy, the equities of their company or whatever it is they're trying to get us to buy, or some policy they want us to adopt. But, the history of the thing is not that. The history of the thing is that this dislocation gets worked out. First movers have an advantage. Late movers wind up with the price collapse. That's sort of the history of the thing. And I do think that, and I've talked about this before, I do think the Biden administration still has a tool up its sleeve. The US government can put out a tender to the way, Glencore does in West Africa, to buy shale production that is not currently already committed to investment. So in other words, I'm going to basically provide the funding for companies in the United States to increase drilling, or in Canada or Mexico to increase drilling. And then the United States government will take possession of that oil and gas when it becomes available, either to put back in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or if markets and allies still have a need for more oil, to ship it outside the United States, or use it to bring down prices. So as a sort of a quasi SBR sale. So, I think the administration still has tools. I'm sure those tools are not popular with very progressive constituents. But, in a national emergency, the president has still has things he can do. And I think that, time will tell what's necessary and whether some of that production might come on in Canada or other places anyway, in which case the market will respond and the dislocation will be handled.
Go ahead, Ellen.
I can't help but comment on this because I'm a historian at heart and by training, and Amy, your proposal for what the U.S. government could actually do is so interesting because it reminds me so much of something that happened during World War II, which was when the Roosevelt administration created something called the Petroleum Reserves Corporation, which was basically this corporation where they wanted to go out and buy oil reserves in other countries, and they very nearly purchased the holdings in Saudi Arabia that the precursor to Aramco called KSOC, which was mostly owned by Standard Oil of California, had owned. And they were kind of, during the war, it wasn't very profitable for them, and they were looking to kind of offload it at the end of World War II, and they very nearly sold it to this Petroleum Reserves Corporation that was created by Harold Ickes, who was the petroleum czar, the oil czar for Roosevelt, and the only reason it seems that deal fell through was because they weren't willing to pay enough for the companies to sell. And so then instead the two oil companies decided to bring on two other oil companies, and then together they formed what became Aramco, and later grew into the Aramco that we know today. So it's so interesting that you bring that up, because it's not necessarily without historical precedent. And I thank you all for humoring my little historical digression.
We're always a fan of historical digressions here at NAEI. A question from Jason Davidson in the chat, and Jason has clearly done his reading already quite rapidly of the book, and it has to do with the Kremlin's view of the oil weapon within your taxonomy in the book, Emma. Because Russia is a super exporter of oil and gas, did it make sense for Putin to think that the EU wouldn't respond forcefully to the invasion of Ukraine? Or did he underestimate that risk because of the institutional and personalization flaws that you outline in the resource curse taxonomy in that pathway?
Thanks, Jason. And yeah, you definitely have done your reading. So I think, one of the points that I try and make in the book is that there are these different ways that oil can impact petrostates' foreign policy. And in some states, they interact with one another. So, the personalization flaws that come out of the resource curse are worsened by the fact that the state has a bunch of money to spend on the military, is worsened by the fact that the state is, has a bunch of others dependent on it for energy exports, etc. I think that the most interesting thing is, I talked about the oil weapon in the context in which it has been commonly understood or used, which is to say, one country taking aim at another, cutting off oil or gas supplies, and it's much more effective when it's gas supplies and it's in a pipeline, to try and compel policy change. And the conclusion I come to in the book is it's actually not particularly effective as a geopolitical weapon. But what's really interesting about the Russian case is the European Union has spent the time since 2006, since the first shutoff of Russian gas through Ukraine, trying to insulate themselves from exactly that kind of shock. So trying to integrate the European energy market in a way that made it very difficult for Russia to isolate any one European country and then use oil as a lever. And instead, what we've seen over the last couple of months is this sort of push and pull between Russia and the European Union over which side is more dependent on a general level, right? Is the whole European Union willing to cut itself off from Russian oil or Russian gas? Is Russia so dependent on those revenues? Can they find other consumers? And this is very distinct from the discussions that we've had about the oil weapon in the past, because this is at a scale that I think nobody really ever thought that it would come to this point where Europe might actually consider stopping taking all Russian oil and gas. And, we've seen even in the last few weeks just how contentious it still is within Europe. So, if I could go back and rewrite the book, I think that would be a really interesting addition here.
That's really interesting. We are getting a little short on time right now, but I see that a question that has come up a few times in the chat is the relationship between what we're seeing in the oil market at present and a transition to renewables. And so I just want to go down the line, and I apologize for shortening your answers here, but I want to get your reaction to this overall, because I think there may be differences among you. Two questions. One, does the current oil shock and energy market in the energy market increase the likelihood of a rapid transition to renewables? Will it speed up a transition to renewables? And depending on your answer to that, will that transition, if it happens, lead to increased conflict globally, driven by petrostates and that transition happening? So Emma, since you answered first, we can go to you and then go down the line.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's the big question I don't think we know the answer to. I am somewhat skeptical that this crisis is going to massively accelerate a green transition, at least in the absence of further substantial shocks, right? So if we did see sanctions on Russia precipitating Russia cutting off the gas flow to Europe, perhaps we might see something there. But I'm skeptical that we're going to see a larger transition in the absence of that. But I will say that just in general, I think regardless of the timescale on which it happens, I think we do need to be aware that petrostates, many of these states have enjoyed influence, leverage, wealth. They are going to be becoming poorer, more isolated, more insulated over the next few decades as the world transitions away from fossil fuels. And for many of them, that will end up being a choice between a very difficult economic transition, political transition domestically, or chasing after sort of the last lowest common denominator oil buyer in the world. And neither of them is a particularly good option. So I'll pass it on to Ellen.
Yeah, so I'm gonna just go out there and give you my opinion with the understanding that this may not really be a very popular opinion, but I really don't think that the current state of renewable energy technology, its availability, its reliability, and its prices are something that most of the world can depend on and can pay for. Now, yes, oil and gas are much more expensive than they used to be, but when you factor in a lot of the unreliability of the technology for a lot of the renewable resources, I think that it still we still need oil and gas. We still need these. We still need hydrocarbons. I mean, if you look at where some of the societies and we tend to, I think, have a very Western myopic view, but you think about economies like India, okay, with 1.4 billion people, they have no domestic oil resources to speak of. Are they purchasing massive numbers of electric vehicles? No, they're not. They can't afford them. For most people, it doesn't make sense in India to drive them. They don't even have reliable electricity there in a lot of places. And they're returning to more coal power generation there because that's the resource that they have. And then if you think about it, is it really all that great to run your EV when you're charging it based on a coal-fired power plant? Not really. You're just exchanging one kind of emissions for another. And so I actually think that this crisis, this shock that we're experiencing is leading at least some people to realize how dependent we actually still are on fossil fuels and on hydrocarbons, and that a lack of investment in these in this over the past many years due to low oil prices is really coming back to haunt us and in the decisions that a lot of countries have made to be dependent on Russian sources of energy. And so I think that we're not necessarily going to see the transition accelerated. Perhaps we'll see a wiser transition where with the acknowledgement that that hydrocarbons are still essential for our society in many ways, and perhaps we'll see a more at least I would hope that we would see a better deployment of renewable resources in ways that are more that maximize their effectiveness, and we don't just close off our hydrocarbon and our nuclear sources willy-nilly with the assumption that they can just be replaced by wind turbines.
And Amy,
Well,
your
I guess
response?
that gives me the last word. So I'm going to be brief because I know we're out of time, but I tweeted this morning something that didn't get retweeted, and I don't know why, because it's a very interesting statistic. China is going to add this year, they're on track to add this year 108 gigawatts of solar power capacity. To put that in perspective, this is in just this year, 2022. To put that in perspective, the total solar capacity currently in the United States is 124 gigawatts. So that's what they're adding in 1 year. And, there's momentum. If you're a country like China, renewable energy and electrification is something that allows you to have domestic energy that's not subject to international disruption. And I think other countries are going to look in that same direction. Indonesia's studying how to best put in a carbon price. So I think, when we talk about, a coal plant reopening in the EU, or the fact that there isn't a rapid retirement of coal in China, those things are problematical, but it doesn't mean that the momentum to clean tech isn't gaining speed. Car sales in the United States overall have been flagging because there's a shortage of supply, but sales of EVs have never been higher. Same in other parts of the world. So I do think that this crisis will actually create more momentum. It's not different from past crises, same thing. There is always a question about what happens with oil and gas over time, based on just population economic growth. But ultimately, the momentum for renewables and for EVs and clean tech in general, and energy efficiency technologies through digital is huge.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you to all three for those insightful answers. Emma, over to you for a final word.
Great. Well, thanks to you all for attending today, for watching us online, and thank you so much to Ellen and Amy for joining us for a really interesting discussion on a difficult and interesting topic. Again, the book, which I have to shill, is Oil, the State and War from Georgetown University Press. But again, we hope to be continuing to have these discussions going forward. And thanks to the New American Engagement Initiative and the Scowcroft Center for hosting this discussion. Please do join us for our next event on June 23rd, which will take a look at global food security, one of the other big issues arising out of this war. Thank you all.